You're listening to episode 51 of the Confident Rider podcast with Jane Pike. Hey team, a bit of a story time episode for you today. One horse and one human. And both of these examples, I think, speak really well to the question, when is it ever not appropriate to calm down? Now, this comes up in relationship to nervous system activation, or us going into a sympathetic response. And for the sake of example, we are going to be specifically talking about fear and anxiety today, and our tendency to mute that or dull it down for a variety of reasons, most of all our own comfort, but what that actually does to the energy that presents and whether that is the healthiest way for us to be going about things, both in the short and the long term. So Nadia is one of the happy trio that make up my herd, and she is 16 too. She's a big chestnut mare, a warm blood, and we've been together for a couple of years. And most of the work that we've been doing together has been about regulation, about allowing her to hold bigger energies, hold more discomfort, if you like, and work through that in a way that is balancing and honoring of the energy that's presenting. Previously, I would have said that our entire process together focused on relaxation, but given the context of our conversation today, I've really changed that up, and I recognize that coming back to calm is not always the most useful place for us to return to. And that's simply because whenever we have that high energetic charge in our system that comes along with the experience of something high tensile like fear or anxiety, that energy needs to dissipate. It needs to be moved through and processed. And if we come back to calm too quickly, the natural release doesn't occur. And so what we actually have is trapped energy in the system. We have us putting a lid on the energetic activation that's there. And unfortunately, that doesn't make the energy impotent. It doesn't make it disappear. It just means that it goes somewhere else. That can come about in a variety of different ways, as behavioral issues, as a shutdown horse, a shutdown human for that matter. It can come about as disease in the body, in the muscles, in the cells, in the organs, so many different places that stored survival energy goes when it's unable to be released or processed effectively and efficiently. Interestingly as well, if you are feeling that you consistently have experiences that are out of sync with what is presenting in your reality, meaning that if you find yourself anxious, but feasibly there's no reason for you to be anxious, or if your horse is reacting in a way that is disproportionate to what it is that they're going through as well, what that is stored survival stress. That is your system liberating energy that has been pushed down or kept a lid on in some way, and it's coming to the surface. And if you aren't resourced or skilled to deal with that, then not only does that happen on a loop, so always our nervous system is seeking to have a corrective emotional experience. But in order for that integration to occur, you need some skills, right? You need some resources. Your container, your neurological container needs to be big enough to be able to hold the energy of what's happening. And if we continue to keep pushing it down or continue to distract or separate ourselves from what it is that's going on, then we find ourselves in a state of chronic activation. This chronic activation is really disabling in so many ways, because not only does it leave us or our horses in a state of hyper alertness and hyperreactivity, but we are unable to really connect. We're unable to re-embody ourselves. We're unable to have relationships or responses that are connected to our environment and what it is that's going on, because we are constantly in reactive mode. We're constantly in this sympathetic response. So Nadia, when she came to me, had a high level of chronic activation in her system. It was evident in her muscles. It was evident in the amount of separation anxiety that she displayed when she went away from the other horses. It was evident in the way that she felt as a ridden companion. It felt like we were two very separate units. And that was really obvious on the ground as well. The other manifestation of it that came up was the contact. So she was described as being really fussy in the contact. When I rode her, she indeed felt very fussy in the contact. She got very hyper aware of her mouth, or was very hyper aware of her mouth, to the point where I decided that the beginnings of our ridden career were going to be bitless, because any conversation that we tried to have was taken over by this concern about the bit. So I took that away, and it's only been recently that I've reintroduced it really successfully, actually, which I was really excited about, but that's kind of separate to our conversation now. So I was riding Nadia in the arena recently, and we've reached this really exciting place where it feels like we've really come together. It feels like we're a team. And Nadia, of all the horses that I've ever ridden, really looks to me for support. She looks to me for the leadership. And when I tell her that it's okay, that she can trust herself and she can trust me, she really does that. She has such a big heart. It's such a privilege to be partnering with her. But the other day when I rode her, for the first time in quite a long time, she felt quite uptight right from the beginning. And I thought, you know what, I'm not going to do any in-hand work or groundwork at the start of this session. And I took her down to the arena, and I could tell from the start, through her eye, through her focus, through the way that she was holding her body, that she wasn't as relaxed as she had been for the last little while. The other thing that happened was our arena is a relative distance from the other horses. So we have a little yards, stables type area where I feed them. And so you have to walk a little bit down the road, just the way that the lay of the land is at our property, a little bit down the road, down a long drive, and then our arena is there. So Dee, very helpfully, kept calling out to Nadia. And this happens, on and off, just in terms of herd dynamics. But on this particular day, it was really upsetting her. And in the past, it had been upsetting her as well. That had been something where I felt like we could establish a fairly good rapport, and she was focused on the work and we were kind of in it together, until she heard one of her friends call out, and then her mind would kind of leave the building and we'd have to go back to ground zero. So that happened again. She got hijacked again to an extent by Dee's call. And in the past, what I would have done is got off and worked her on the ground, for the simple reason that she didn't have the resources and we didn't have the resources together to be able to work through that safely under saddle. So when your resources are smaller than the stresses, that's when the stress becomes overwhelming. And when you are able to increase your resources to the point where they are just ever so slightly bigger than your stresses, and hopefully a lot bigger than your stresses eventually, but when you're able to increase the capacity to that extent, then you can start to have a conversation. And so the other day when this happened, I was actually really thrilled, because what I recognized was this was one of the first times that I'd felt resourced enough to be able to deal with what was happening on her back. It didn't feel great. It's not that automatically I was like, oh yay, I'm so excited I have a really tense horse. I was just like, I think this is something that we can work through together, right? This is something that I don't need to get off for. We can do this together in sync as a ridden unit now. How it presented was when Dee called out, her head kind of snapped around, she lost focus, her body went rigid, and it felt like my seat was meeting a hard edge. So prior to that, our rides have been very connected, very soft. It's felt really wonderful. I can't stop grinning. But in this particular moment, there was a separation between us. We felt like two very distinct units as opposed to two units operating together. And what I wanted to do, or what I recognized that I needed to do at that moment, was if I had brought her back to calm, if I'd been like, okay, let's stand still, calm down, that energy still would have been present in her system. What I would have been getting was, if there was a semblance of calm in that moment, it wouldn't have been true calm. It wouldn't have been true relaxation, because at that moment that she responded to D calling out, we were at the apex of a stress cycle. We were on top of the mountain. So if you think of how a cardiograph looks, and you have those peaks and troughs, at that point, Nadia was at one of those peaks. And the trough, the base of the trough, would have been relaxation. But in order to come back down, we have to dissipate the energy that is present in that moment. And it's unrealistic to expect the drop to be that fast or that efficient without that energy needing to go somewhere. This is where we get shut down horses, right? This is where we have situations where all of a sudden, or out of the blue, are often descriptors for these types of events, where we've shut the energy down, we've put a cap on the energy, we have a presentation of calm to some extent, until you get to recognize what true calm looks like. But we have a presentation of calm that is actually just the lid on a boiling volcano. So I asked myself, how is it that I can integrate this energy? How is it that we can dissipate this energy that I'm feeling, this tight horse that I have underneath me? How is it that I can move through that in a way that honors what it is that's presenting and brings her back to me? And this is a really important point. This is probably the key point for the whole conversation that we have today. There is a catharsis of energy, which means just getting rid of energy, letting it discharge, and there's an integration of energy, and those are two very different things. So a catharsis of energy, you see this time and time again, would be someone saying, oh, my horse has a lot of energy today, putting them on the end of a lunge line and letting them whip around in a circle until they're tired. Yes, that gets rid of the energy to some extent. However, it's not an integrative experience. It's not a corrective emotional experience. There is no integration of the energy. There is no assimilation of the energy, and there is no neurological nurturing and lesson that comes off the back of that. There's just a discharge. It's the same if we get really angry. Discharge of anger without being connected to the experience. And I'm not suggesting rage or causing harm to someone else, although that it can manifest in those ways. That kind of disconnection is a catharsis, but does nothing to actually create a more responsive way of going about things in the future. And that's what we're looking for our horses to develop, and what we're looking to develop ourselves. We're wanting them to feel more resourced in the future, for their container, for their neurological and emotional container to open up, to be able to hold more depth and breadth of experience than they could previously. And that only happens with this kind of integration that I'm talking about. The other example that you see with people is kind of just riding them up mountains or like galloping forever. It's a catharsis, but it does nothing to actually increase their capacity to hold energy and to hold tension in their body. And that can be confusing, I guess, in terms of like, well, why would you want to increase your capacity to hold tension? I don't mean hold tension indefinitely. I mean be able to be in the face of an emotional experience, to experience an activation in the nervous system and not feel the need to disassociate or have your mind leave the building. Integration then happens when we're able to stay with ourselves, we're connected to our bodies, we're connected to our internal experience, and we're simultaneously connected to our environment. If you think of it on a human level, whenever our lid gets flipped, so whenever we go into a reactive state where we're governed simply by that fight, flight, or freeze response, that causes us to essentially get outside of ourselves. We're not really connected to our internal experience at that point. We're not connected to our environment at that point. We're really in an instinctual place. And being able to open up to be able to hold those experiences means that we need to slowly, this isn't a quick fix, but slowly increase our capacity to stay with ourselves, to stay connected with our environment, to stay connected with activated energy in a way that doesn't cause us to flee, literally and metaphorically. So this was the point that I found myself pondering with Nadia. I could see that she was very activated. I could see that she was disembodied in terms of like her mind was with her friends. It was no longer with me. There was an energetic charge in her system that needed to go somewhere, and expecting her to come back to calm was not the solution. This is where it also comes back to knowing your horse. So I had this conversation with some friends recently, and we were talking about this, and I said, in some ways, how I responded to this was counterintuitive to what it is that I would have liked to have done, because I would have liked to have calmed things down, right? I'm not suggesting that this is the easy option. Like, it would be lovely to be like, calm down, Nadia, and to have her come back to this like lovely baseline, but that's not actually what happens. And I know what doesn't happen on a systemic level to make it, viable in the long term. So what I know about Nadia is she's very comfortable in canter. She has a very beautiful, balanced canter. I think it's the nicest canter that I've ever ridden. Her trot is huge, and when she gets into trot, that's the place that she most easily gets ahead of herself. So when I thought about ways for us to move through this energy, I thought that canter seemed like the best option. Now, that was the best option for Nadia. For Dee, it wouldn't have been the best option because he's younger, he's not as established in the canter, and so the discombobulation that most likely would have been presented in his body in association with being in an anxious place would have meant that it would have escalated the concern rather than actually brought it back. For Nadia, though, canter felt like a good thing. So we went into canter, but alongside of that, going back to this idea of integration as opposed to catharsis, I recognized that she needed to come back to me. She needed to be present to me. Again, there are a number of tools that you can resource yourself with that have to be practiced in situations where they're not needed, meaning that once you've gone into this place of concern, that is not the time to introduce a new skill to either horse or human. But what I knew about Nadia was that because of the previous bit concern that she had, or the concern with the contact, that I didn't want that to be our resource for bringing her back to her body. I knew that because she was in that slightly activated place, because of her past conditioning and past associations with the bit and with contact, that the potential for that exacerbating the situation rather than relieving it were there. And so I had to find another way to establish that communication between us. With Dee, what I might have done is just picked up on the contact on the inside and waited for his ear to flick back to me. That would have been a recognition of both him acknowledging me and acknowledging the connection, and as a consequence of that, acknowledging his own body and his own presence and kind of bringing him back to himself. But with Nadia, I didn't want that to be our point of reference just because of everything I just mentioned. So the thing that I came up with in the moment for her was to cup my hand and just kind of pat her neck with it so that it made a sound. And that was enough for her ear to flick back towards me. It's a very non-invasive thing to do. There was a little bit of sound attached to it as well, which gave us both something to focus on. And every time I felt that she went outside of herself, I did that to bring her back. These are the things that we really need to remember. We need to remember that we have to meet the energy where it's at in order for it to be moved through, but that movement needs to be integrated so that there is a connection to the self for your horse, a connection to their body and where it is they are in space, and a connection to you. And for ourselves, when we're in an activated place, we need to try and stay with that in a way that either allows us to be present to what's happening or if it feels too much for us to be able to deal with in that moment, to be able to access tools that allow us to move through that space as efficiently and constructively as possible. So after we went through that experience, after we started cantering around and she had moments of losing focus and coming back, then her breath started to come. I could hear the natural rhythm of the breath in response to her movement. She did a couple of snorts, and by the end of the session, we were able to ride around in a really relaxed way, long rein, at the trot, all of the sorts of things that we were able to do previously, which was a huge win from my perspective. And I was so proud of both of us for being able to negotiate that in a way that felt really healthy and in a way that wasn't putting a lid on what it is that's happening and trying to kind of instigate calm. So I guess the thing that I would like you to have a think about when you're out there with your horse is what is required in this moment. And if energy is required, if they need to move their feet, if that's what they're communicating, if you can see that there's a level of activation in the system that needs to go somewhere, how can you do that in a connected way? How can you do that that allows them to actually come back to themselves, come back to you, that doesn't shut anything down or put a cap on it, that will inevitably come out somewhere or someplace else? Now, the human story is actually about my little boy, Flynn. And on Friday of last week, he cut his foot quite badly. And it was a little bit of a rigmarole, actually, because we're in lockdown at the moment. The usual ways that we go about things, like to take him to the doctor or take him to the urgent doctors or whatever, it just wasn't there. Like, you can't just drop in, you can't just make an appointment. It's a whole process. We had to send photos, we had to do a little video call, and then they decide whether it's necessary for you to come in, and then we had an appointment, and so on and so forth. So after all of that, we had an appointment later on that afternoon with our very lovely doctor, and it was obvious that he needed stitches. Now, Flynn was really concerned about this for good reason, right? Like, he's little, it's a big deal. He didn't want it to happen. And I was really conscious of not trying to make him calm, because it's the same principle that I was talking about with Nadia, in that if someone is in that sympathetic place, in that activated place, expecting them to come back to calm down, that, it's okay, take a breath, shh, don't cry, don't shout, don't scream, is a huge dishonoring of actually what their organic response to the situation is. Now, I know that some of you out there will be thinking, well, what, you just let them be completely distressed? I'm not suggesting that either. That's not what I'm supporting. I'm just saying that muting the natural expression, trying to stop the crying, trying to stop the whatever it is that's coming up, will actually only cause that energy to go in. And so my response to the situation was to try, to the best of my ability, because it's quite hard, it's a hard thing to do to watch someone be upset, to try and not make it okay, to be as supportive as possible, and obviously calm any concerns that were exaggerated or inflated, and be as supportive as possible, but give resources that actually allow that energy to move through rather than shut it down. Now, the anesthetic was a really unpleasant experience. Anything in the feet, I think, it just makes me curl my toes thinking about it. But the anesthetic was, and the stitches as well were a little bit of a rigmarole. And he really cried and shouted and screamed in response to that. But knowing what I know now, that energy was out, right? If I'd tried to calm him down, if I'd told him, shh, don't cry, all of the things that often we do to make it more socially appropriate to be in situations. So in the doctor's clinic, for example, you want to kind of make it okay for everyone else, and you don't want to be too expressive because it kind of makes everyone else feel uncomfortable. A lot of what we do, I believe, is based on those social niceties. It's not based on actual expression. It's not based on actually us being able to get to a better place. And that is muting our natural capacity to let the body do what it needs to do. Maybe a little bit of an extreme example, but so many of us don't let ourselves cry. We don't let ourselves respond to situations where we feel in our guts really overwhelmed or we feel really anxious. We don't let ourselves do the things that we need to do to be able to process that emotion. And as a consequence, the energy goes somewhere, right? We lock it down within the body, we get tummy ache, we get tight, sore shoulders, we get headaches, we get snappy, we get irritable, we're exhausted. Like all of these things are symptomatic of chronic nervous system activation, not always, but often. And it's because we just aren't skilled and we aren't supported often in organically allowing ourselves to feel these experiences. Calm is not always the answer. Calm is not always the healthy answer. Calm is often a dishonoring of the natural stress cycles that come throughout the day. This example at the doctors is an extreme one, but also what we find culturally happening as well is that a lot of us are much more sedentary than we would choose to be. So we might have office jobs, we might have jobs which see us at the desk or the computer a lot. And throughout the course of the day, we are going through the natural stress cycles that the body naturally moves through, sitting down. And then at the end of the day, we might do yoga practices or we might do practices of calm and relaxation. But actually, the body is in a relatively activated state simply because we're always bringing it back to calm, when actually what we need to do is discharge. We actually need to move. We actually need to find ways of expressing ourselves that are healthy and regulated and resource us, as opposed to constantly feeling like we need to be muted and calm and relaxed and all of these things which, are thrown around. And it's not to say those are bad things or that we don't want to be able to go to those places. That's not what I'm saying either. It's just that what I want you to recognize is that within activated cycles, we need that energy to be released. We need to find ways of integrating that experience within the nervous system so it's not just a catharsis, but that it is connected to what it is that we are experiencing. And as a consequence of that, there is a nervous system experience that is corrective and integrated. It's a really cool thing. It's a really cool thing. So have a think about it. I'm so happy to answer any questions or throw this around with you because I think it's it's simplistic but difficult at the same time. And the thing where we get stuck, I guess, is that, or the place that we get stuck is in not having the resources that we need to be able to hold that energy. And so you can recognize that, this is bigger than my body right now. This feeling is bigger than my body, or this energetic activation is bigger than my body. If you kind of don't know what to do with that, then it's easy to feel like you're turning in on yourself. So the key is to stay with yourself, to see what it feels like to not try to distract or numb yourself in the midst of being in an activated place. And if that feels like it's too much for your body to hold, to follow the natural instincts of your body in terms of what is my impulse right now? How is it that I feel like I need to move? Do I feel like I need to walk or run or move my body in a way that it's telling me to? Do I feel like I need to shake or stamp? Like, what is it that is coming up for me? And that's a big part of it as well, being able to tap into those impulses, being free to express ourselves in natural and organic ways that are outside some of the linear movement ideas or exercise patterns that we will have set up for ourselves. Throwing it around, guys. I'm throwing it around. I think it's fascinating, and I'm going to be doing a lot more on this subject. So hit me with your questions if you have them, because we can explore them in future episodes. All right, team, you look after you, please. If you want to get in touch, confidentwriter.online is the place to do so. And if you want to come hang with me in my membership program, confidentwriter.online/joyride. Would love to see you there. Have a great day.